He was a wealthy Texas businessman, as well as a loving and devoted father.
Greg was in the IT business and had been very successful.
He was an awesome dad. He was caring, loving, very protective.
But he couldn't protect his family from a deadly home invasion.
He was shot in the head.
There was a great deal of blood.
How am I going to tell my daughter her dad is dead?
And in the course of their investigation, detectives will untangle a web of lies to reveal a horrific act of betrayal.
The more deeply they delved, the more interesting that story became.
The motive was money. Tried and true, age-old money.
October 13th, 2011. It's a quiet morning in the affluent suburb of Keller, Texas, when police receive a frantic call from 42-year-old Michelle Williams.
What's going on? My husband was shot. Somebody was in the house. Fighting really bad. He was shot in the head. Your husband was shot in the head?
It was very noisy, and she was screaming that an intruder had come into the home, and police, of course, were dispatched immediately. Their first concern was to get in there and make sure that nobody else was in the house and ensure everyone's safe.
Officers search the home, but there is no sign of the intruder. In the bedroom, they find Michelle's husband, 40-year-old Greg Williams, shot to death.
Greg was actually found on his bed and had a gunshot wound to his head.
Greg had been shot in the temple region. There was a great deal of blood.
Michelle says the shooter was a masked man who broke in while they were asleep.
She had been asleep on the couch with their young daughter, Michaela, who was 4 at the time. She heard a noise. She rushed into the bedroom. She saw a person dressed in black, and that person struck her in the face, that she briefly lost consciousness. When she awoke, she realized that her husband had been shot in the head.
At first glance, it appears to be an attempted robbery gone wrong. But investigators will soon realize there is much more to this case than meets the eye. Greg Williams was born in Dallas, Texas on March 24, 1971, to a modest middle-class family.
His father was an electrician, and his mother worked retail jobs. It was not really a happy childhood. I mean, every family fights about money, but he had a very good upbringing. You know, his parents did not divorce until he was an adult.
His family's difficulties seemed to instill a sense of ambition that would serve Greg well as he embarked on a career of his own.
He was driven, he was focused, he would get upset if something wasn't done right. He would work 8 to 12 to 14 hours a day sometimes.
Greg met the woman who would become his first wife at a party in 1993. And it wasn't long before they started a family of their own.
He had several different jobs. When I met him, he was teaching at a martial arts school in Irving. We bought our first house, was his house that his parents owned when he was born. And our daughter was born in that house. He was an awesome dad. He was caring, loving, very protective.
He was a provider, so his first and foremost priority was his job and providing for his children. One thing that I remember most about my dad is that whenever he made a promise to be somewhere or to do something, he always went through with that promise.
After working hard for several different employers, Greg finally decided to go into business for himself with an information technology company.
I worked full-time and we had our kids, and he slowly just built it up, and then it just finally boomed. I mean, he got one major client, and then that client told another client. It took him about 8 to 10 years to build this company where he wanted it.
But success would come at the cost of his marriage.
Right at the end of 2002, we split up. We just couldn't make it work. We're just two different people. I am a homebody. He likes going places. We got a divorce. We would stay very involved in each other's lives. I would help him pick up some computer parts he needed because it was right around the corner from my office. We had an open custody arrangement, and we stayed in the same town for a long time, so it was very easy.
Greg focused on his burgeoning business and his daughter. But in 2004, he would get another chance at love when he met a successful woman online. Michelle Zahn was 2 years older than Greg and already had 3 children of her own. The two found they had much in common.
She had made her own way in life. She was hardworking, charismatic, and of course, I think that's probably one of the things that drew Greg to her. She was very much a person that had to take care of herself and take care of those that she loved. Their relationship seemed to be happy and full of energy. They seemed to be very much in love.
It didn't take long for their relationship to blossom.
They dated for a while, and then he introduced me and my stepmother, and then she moved in. So I had been living with her from the time I was 6 years old. My dad was always spoiling her, getting her things that she wanted. He invested in a business for her, a frozen yogurt business, and she helped with his business, and everything seemed fine.
In 2007, Michelle gave Greg another daughter, Michaela. They decided to get married the following year.
I thought it was really cool having a little sister. Now I had someone else I could help take care of and love on and play with.
When he married Michelle, his business had already taken off. They had a great relationship and they were happy. They would go on cruises. They would have parties and get-togethers.
He was probably making in the range of $800,000 a year. They lived in a very nice house, about a 5,000 square foot home, but they had leased that property and actually were in the process of purchasing a new home in the range of about $4.5 million home.
But just as they were about to close the deal, a masked gunman took everything from the Williams family, and Texas police are determined to catch them. Coming up, was it a robbery gone wrong or something far worse?
He has quite a few not so good friends.
Police in Keller, Texas, are investigating the murder of 40-year-old technology mogul Greg Williams, shot by an intruder during an apparent break-in. The masked man struck Greg's wife, Michelle, as he fled the scene, but their daughter, Michaela, was left unharmed.
It was obviously a fresh bruise. There was subcutaneous bleeding under the skin. She was hit by the intruder with a wrench. EMT people arrived at the scene. They checked her out. They also made sure that Michaela was okay. Their job was pretty limited because Greg was obviously deceased at that time.
As detectives searched the bedroom, they immediately noticed several clues.
There was a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun that was lying by the bed. There was a wrench lying by the bed, and there was some damage to the doors that led from the bedroom out onto the patio or the pool area outside. There was a screwdriver lying another 10 or 15 feet from the door.
It seemed as though the screwdriver was used to enter that door.
Initially, it looks like a robbery, but the shooter didn't attempt to steal anything from the house.
There was no jewelry or personal property that was taken. The gun that was found next to the bed belonged to Greg. Obviously, it was an affluent neighborhood. They were people that, if you knew them by reputation, that had some money there. They had, my recollection is, about $20,000 there in the home.
It also appears that the killer was exceptionally careful. When police dust for fingerprints, they quickly discover there aren't any.
If you don't find the murderer's fingerprints, that can be all kinds of reasons. If nothing else, they're wearing gloves. But you find fingerprints of a 4-year-old. You find fingerprints of the victim. You find fingerprints of the wife that lives there. But everything was very, very, very cleaned up, straightened up, wiped clean. There were no fingerprints whatsoever.
As the investigation continues, detectives realize this crime scene isn't everything it appears to be.
More and more things seemed curious. They recovered some glass outside, and the glass was out on the patio. Normally, you would think that if someone breaks in, the glass goes into the room, not outside the room.
The glass was on the wrong side of the door. The way the gun and wrench were positioned during that scene staged.
The question is, why? After Michelle receives medical treatment, detectives sit down with her to make sense of the conflicting evidence.
Try to help me and kind of just run over the store with you again. Maybe you can fill in any gaps for me. Okay.
I heard a noise, and I get up.
This was what time, you think?
4 something.
Okay.
I didn't get past the bedroom door. I opened it, and I got hit by, I still don't know what. I could see it was a male in dark stuff, dark clothing, but I couldn't tell you really any details about that.
He ran out the door. What did you call to him?
I crawled over to Greg, and I grabbed a hold of his hand, and I felt blood run down the bed. And so I called 911, and while I was calling 911, I ran out there to check on Michaela.
When police ask Michelle why she and Michaela were sleeping on the couch, she says they moved their daughter to the living room after she fell down the stairs in the middle of the night.
I know it's personal, but I have to ask. No prior history with marital problems, no problem with debts or anything like that?
No, money's not a problem. Relationship's not a problem.
Okay.
Everything was good until the middle of the night. Everything was good.
According to Michelle, she and Greg had never been happier. In fact, they were closing on their new house the very next day.
The significance of that would seem to be that at least one of the two people believed that the marriage was stable. I mean, if people are having difficulty, they're not making plans to go plunk down a lot of money for a $4.5 million home.
However, Michelle does fear that her husband may have made some dangerous enemies.
Anybody you think might have done it?
He has quite a few not so good friends that I've met, drug dealers and bad people. He's kind of like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde.
As she was talking, she revealed some personal facts about Greg. He was very much into physical fitness. He was a bodybuilder and a person of some significant build and musculature. She revealed that he was heavily into the use of steroids, which, of course, can be used in bodybuilding and can also have significant side effects.
Greg bought steroids from somebody, I don't know who, but he has steroids in the refrigerator in our bedroom.
And what? Refrigerator?
There's a refrigerator in our master closet. He keeps that very private and away from me and Michaela.
From the evidence police have gathered so far, it looks like Michelle could be right.
There were anabolic steroids found at the scene where Greg's body was, and he had apparently been obtaining those steroids illegally. There was some concern that maybe his involvement with people either dealing or distributing anabolic steroids might have had something to do with Greg's death.
Coming up, did Greg's secret get him killed? Or did someone just try to make it look that way?
They're giving me information about the stuff on the scene that doesn't match the story.
While detectives continue their investigation into the murder of millionaire Greg Williams, his ex-wife and daughter are just finding out what happened.
I got a phone call from his brother, bawling, telling me that Greg was gone. And I don't remember too much after that for a few minutes. It was so hard. All I could think about is, how am I going to tell my daughter her dad is dead?
I was 12. I was daddy's little girl, daddy's little princess, and I did anything and everything I could to make my dad happy. I was in a lot of shock, and then it was sadness, depression, and all that.
There were some thoughts that perhaps an intruder was related to dealings with the anabolic steroids, money that was owed either to Greg or by Greg. These were all ideas that were explored.
His ex-wife confirms that Greg sometimes used steroids, but doesn't believe it could have had anything to do with his death.
I knew he was taking steroids. He'd probably been doing them about 5 years. Before the business got busy, he would do competitions like over in Prague, kickboxing, different types of martial arts. He always liked to stay in shape. I don't think Greg got involved with the wrong people. Greg would never bring that into his life and put his children at risk.
Investigators speak to everyone who knew Greg and canvass the neighborhood searching for any possible leads.
There was no evidence shown that somebody, as they did this canvass, had seen or heard or filmed any sort of vehicle or any person that didn't belong in the neighborhood, particularly at 4:30 in the morning. But this was an affluent neighborhood, so you would imagine, and there were, in fact, some security cameras mounted on various houses and recorded cars that came in through the security gate.
Detectives searched the security tapes looking for any suspicious vehicles, but there was no trace of the intruder.
The only car that had come in during the period of time in question was traced to belong to the newspaper deliverer.
In fact, the more police look at the evidence, the more they begin to doubt that a break-in even occurred.
Michelle's story that morning began to break down after a bit of time as some of the facts became obviously inconsistent.
There's some details I really need to go over with them. They're giving me information about the stuff on the scene just doesn't match the story, so I'm trying to find out, for sure what happened here. That's my job. You have your gates dummy locked, which means there's no way that anybody would have got in or out of the backyard. They found some pry marks, but the only way those pry marks could have been put on that door, the door would have been open, not closed when it was done. So the question is, how did someone access the house? You have to be honest with me and tell me anything else that's going on, because basically what information we're getting right now doesn't match up with the scene. Okay?
I'm telling you what I know.
Michelle sticks to her story, but during questioning, police float another theory to explain how Greg was killed under such mysterious circumstances.
Suicide, if under some circumstances of stress, could be a reasonable way, when she was the only one in the home, to explain how he was dead and she didn't do it.
As we did that, picked the case apart, it seemed as though the evidence supported that Greg indeed killed himself.
What I recall from the crime scene pictures is that the pistol was right there and the cartridge case was right beside it.
At the time of Greg's death, there was a lot going on in his life. There were some concerns that his business was starting to falter, or that just the couple had overextended themselves financially. Also, there was some concern about Greg's use of anabolic steroids and how that might have affected his mental health.
Had side effects from the steroids he was using driven Greg to take his own life?
His demeanor hadn't changed, nothing out of the ordinary recently that would lead you to believe. And again, anything.
Yeah, lately he's been more aggravated and yelling, and Steve's gotten the really bad end of him.
I've got to be honest with you here, because it does change things. Did Greg injure himself and you tried to cover it up?
No, he did not hurt himself.
And you don't have a clue about how that stuff got in those positions by the door or anything like that then?
No, I have no clue.
But if there was no intruder, as investigators believe, and Greg didn't kill himself, they're left with only one other possibility.
The only other thing that could have happened, honestly, could have happened, is if you might have done it.
I did not hurt my husband, and he did not hurt himself.
Okay.
There was a man in my house.
Coming up, as detectives continue to press Michelle, her story changes once again.
I knew I wasn't going to leave here without being able to do the truth.
Detectives are grilling 42-year-old Michelle Williams about the details of her husband's death. Her story about an intruder doesn't match the evidence, and they want to know why she's hiding the truth.
I don't know whether police believed the intruder story from the beginning. There are parts of that story that, if you look closely, perhaps don't feel right. And so in most cases where someone is killed in their home, the spouse is responsible.
You know what happened. So you need to tell me. I mean, this is it. We're getting wits in.
With police chipping away at her story, Michelle finally appears to come clean.
You've got to be honest with me, Michelle. If he did it and you covered it up, just tell me.
He did.
Huh?
He did.
Okay. You want to tell me the story, what really happened now?
Michelle indicated that, well, it really was not an intruder, that she had made up the story because her husband, who was situationally depressed from time to time, killed himself.
She explained that in order to make it look like an intruder had entered the home, that she had rearranged some items, that she had placed the screwdriver where it was so that it would look as though someone had entered the door. Also, she cleaned up the scene some so that it would not be easily determined that Greg had killed himself.
The rationale that we got was that she didn't want her child to know.
I couldn't let her know that. I took some Chlorox wipes, and I wiped the gun with the blanket that he had right there. And I set it down, and I had to figure out what the hell to do at that point.
You put the gun by the door?
I opened the door and I put the gun on the door. Because if it was hidden by him, of course it was.
Michelle explains that she broke the glass, then arranged the items in the room to make it look like a burglary.
In order to make some sense, I had to have an injury. I was so pain. And I just let myself.
What's that, wrench?
It's a wrench. I went back and opened the back door, and while doing this, I was calling 911 and hoped that somebody could still keep him alive, but I knew he wouldn't make it.
Michelle acknowledges that she had another reason for covering up Greg's suicide as well.
Michelle had a life insurance policy on Greg Williams for $850,000, but it had a suicide clause. So if he commits suicide, she cannot collect the life insurance.
Michelle talked about Greg having periods of extreme depression, and really it was something they kept from the outside world.
After finishing her interrogation, detectives charged Michelle with evidence tampering.
Because it is a criminal offense, I have to read you your rights and explain those to you first. Okay? You're going home.
I knew I wasn't going to leave here without being at the.
She ultimately leaves the police station that day, having signed a statement indicating that he had killed himself.
However, Greg's loved ones don't believe Michelle's new story any more than the first.
The story of a suicide never resonated with anybody. Nobody thought that Greg's personality indicated a suicide.
He had a friend the year before, December 20th, kill himself. And I have only seen Greg cry maybe twice, and that was one of them. He took Taylor on his lap, and he says, "Do not ever do that. That is the most selfish thing you can do to the people that you leave." There was no way he committed suicide whatsoever. I would bet my life on it.
In fact, they're convinced Michelle is the one who murdered Greg, and that she did it for the money.
The police began talking to people that knew more about Michelle's personal life. And the more deeply they delved into that, the more interesting that story became.
For a long time, she was nice to me, but something deep down told me that there was something wrong and that I shouldn't trust her.
I saw the evil in her in the very first time I met her.
Coming up, did Michelle decide to cash in her husband's fortune?
From my experience, when someone wants to commit suicide, they typically don't want to miss. So you put the muzzle of the firearm a little bit closer.
After hours of interrogation, Michelle Williams has confessed, saying she covered up her husband's suicide. But investigators still think she's holding out on them. And the medical examiner's autopsy seems to confirm their suspicions.
We have a very good medical examiner's office in Tarrant County, and the most significant finding was the nature of the wound itself. This was not a contact wound. When you put a gun up to your head like this, it does different things, and the evidence that is left behind can tell you a lot. One of the things that it can tell you is the range from which the shot was fired, and that's important in a case like this.
Based on the state's expert, the gun was an unnaturally far distance from Greg's head whenever it was discharged.
I did the distance determination testing and determined that it was further than 6 inches, but closer than 24 inches. That would have put his arm in a peculiar position, extended out and holding the pistol in a manner a little difficult to shoot himself in the temple.
The report confirms that Greg did not kill himself. He was murdered.
What was wrong with Michelle's story was that it was not true. On October the 13th, Greg's death was officially ruled a homicide by the medical examiner of Tarrant County.
That leaves Michelle as the only suspect, and her behavior in the coming weeks strengthens the argument for her guilt.
Very soon after the autopsy, Greg is cremated. Michelle rushed through this process.
There was no funeral. We were angry. We were really angry the way this situation was handled.
We had a slideshow for my dad. We had his ashes and this picture that my Aunt Michelle made of him. And we basically just memorialized who my dad was and remembered him for who he was.
While the family mourns, investigators dig into Greg and Michelle's financial records to see what they might reveal.
We thought that the financial records could perhaps lead us to some conclusions that would help us establish a motive. And things started jumping out very quickly.
The first thing I did was look at the closing statement for the house that they were supposed to close on the day after he was murdered. And that's when I started seeing a bunch of red flags. Well, the first red flag I noticed was she had submitted forged documents showing that they had approximately $145,000 in the bank account. On October 13th, the date of Greg Williams' death, they had $34,000 in their bank account, and they needed $91,000 for the down payment on the house that they were going to purchase. And there was not enough left to go move into this beautiful house that they had been planning on.
But Greg was making nearly $1 million a year. So where had it all gone?
They had exorbitant expenses, such as they were leasing their Mercedes. They were leasing the house that they lived in. They had $67,000 in credit card charges.
It became apparent the more we got into those records that Greg made the money and Michelle spent the money, and she did so with abandon.
Michelle just spent. She had no budget, so she could just go out and buy whatever she wanted. Greg let her handle all of the books, so he had no idea that she was spending all of that money.
Investigators also learned that the yogurt shop Greg bought for Michelle had never turned a profit.
It didn't make any money. It lost money. In fact,
her nephews told me she would come in on a daily basis and take the cash out of the register. She used the yogurt shop as an ATM.
That's pretty good indication of a motive.
In my 30 years of working at different newspapers, I have never encountered a set of circumstances similar to the Michelle Williams case.
Michelle has already been charged for tampering with evidence, but based on this new information, her charges are upgraded to first-degree murder.
When she was arrested at the gym that she was working at and running with Mr. Wallace, who was a trainer. She was pretty stoic about the arrest. She didn't resist, she didn't run, she didn't burst into tears or anything very, very dramatic.
To me, it felt like justice had happened because she wasn't walking free.
Her bond was set pretty high, about $550,000. She had a lawyer who just sort of incidentally was at least a business client, if not a sometime partner of Greg's. He was hired by Michelle to represent her, and he filed a motion to reduce the bond. It was reduced to $85,000, and she was released, but she was released with an ankle monitor for all the good that did.
Coming up, but will justice be served? Or will a black widow get away with murder?
This was a circumstantial evidence case. Even DNA is circumstantial. But we didn't even have that.
After almost 3 months of investigation, Michelle Williams has been arrested for the murder of her husband, Greg. Police in Texas believe she shot him for the life insurance money after squandering their savings. And investigators learn Michelle didn't wait long before moving on to a new relationship.
A young man, 12 years Michelle's junior, by the name of Gene Wallace. And he became immediately Michelle's not only business partner, but lover. She began seeing him very quickly, within a matter of a couple of weeks after Greg's death.
The circumstantial evidence against Michelle seems to be growing by the day, but prosecutors fear a lack of physical evidence may prevent them from getting a conviction. So they decide to offer Michelle a plea deal instead.
The bargain was that Michelle was to plead guilty to tampering with evidence, a felony charge, and also deadly conduct, essentially recklessly discharging a firearm in someone's direction. And in exchange for her plea to those two charges, she was to get 18 years on the tampering with evidence charge, and she was to get 2 years on the deadly conduct charge.
Michelle accepts the offer, but as her sentencing date approaches, she throws prosecutors a curveball.
We were in the conference room at the DA's office, and they said, well, Michelle is pregnant. I said, well, that strikes me as something I need to see some proof of. Whereupon they produced a sonogram. She's pregnant not only with a baby, she's pregnant with 2 babies. She's pregnant with twins.
They agree to defer Michelle's sentencing until the babies are born, but she immediately breaks the conditions of her release.
She had asked to go to South Texas, down in the Corpus Christi area, I believe, and the probation officer said, no, you can't go that far away. So she figured a way to get her monitor off.
As the result, Michelle goes back to jail, and once again, her story changes.
Lo and behold, she's no more pregnant than I am. She has fabricated the entirety of the story just to buy time. We actually ultimately find the sonogram on the internet. It was all just a charade. I think it's fair to say that she has a very, very loose association with the truth.
The plea deal was wiped away because it was determined that she had lied to the court in making her plea.
She just had to push it further. And that was her undoing.
On September 22, 2014, Michelle Williams finally stands trial for murder. Her attorneys quickly unveil a new defense.
Michelle was trying to perhaps suggest to family and friends that someone else was responsible for Greg's death.
Michelle tried to set me up for the murder.
This was a story that kept on turning. It was like every time something would happen, it would be a new twist, a new turn. You never knew what would happen next.
The only possible motive seems to be revenge, but prosecutors quickly expose it as another lie.
One of her sons was the first witness that the state called to testify against Michelle.
Michelle asked me to call some friends and have them frame Kathy.
She tried to get her son to get a sweatshirt, take it to a field, put a gunshot in it, a gunshot hole, and then break into my car and put it in my car and call the police anonymously. And he would not do that.
It doesn't take the jury long to render their verdict.
Ms. Williams, if you would stand, please.
They found her guilty of murder and guilty of tampering with evidence.
On September 30th, 2014, Michelle is sentenced to 60 years for the murder of her husband and 10 more for tampering with evidence to cover it up.
We were all just really relieved. She wasn't going to be allowed to continue to be on this earth having hurt someone. In the end, she proved herself exactly what my gut feeling told me.
Greg Williams had trusted his second wife with his business, his family, and his fortune. But for Michelle, it would never be enough.
I think ultimately she killed him because she got caught stealing the money.
I believe that he told her that enough was enough, that Michelle concluded that the gravy train had come to a stop and that the golden goose was getting off. He had been betrayed.
Greg had such a big heart. He loved people, he loved his kids. The first anniversary of his death, Taylor and I took balloons and we went back to the house and we let the balloons go.
My dad has missed so many things in my life and continues to miss so many different things and milestones in my life. And I think I'm making my dad proud of me.
What dark impulse led to such violence that night?
one of them saw them in bed together.
When the police officer got there to question her, she was surrounded by candles and photographs.
They realized there was something very different going on.
It's unfortunate, it's terrible, but it happened here, and I think it's happened before, and it'll happen again.
October 2nd, 1999, Westlake Hills, Texas. It's early Saturday morning in this suburban community of 3,000, just minutes away from Austin.
It's a very upscale, very low crime area. Unusual to have really very many calls for service at all in that area.
But several hours before dawn, Deputy Greg Truitt's radio crackles to life.
It was like 2:30, 3 in the morning. I was driving just outside the city of Westlake in the Travis County area, and a call came out. A man called 911 saying that he woke.
He said to the operator he didn't know it had exploded and his guts were spilling out.
They get the ambulance crews en route. I was very close. Another deputy and I arrived at the residence at the same time.
It's a very nice house. It was an architect-designed house. It was a split level, very nice place on a large tract of land, almost on a hilltop, very secluded.
We knock on the door, no answer. So we began just doing a perimeter check of the house, and sure enough, the first windows and door we come to were the bedroom where the caller was in bed, still on his phone when we got there. I think he was still talking to the dispatchers. And he's clenching his hands over his stomach, which was very large. That's when a lady appeared from the other portion of the house in night clothes.
The man in distress is an Austin media mogul and millionaire named Stephen Beard. The woman, Stephen's wife Celeste, is soon joined by her teenage daughter Christina.
They were asleep on the other side of the house, which is a rather large home.
They heard the sirens and saw the flashing lights. And that's when they learned that something had happened to Stephen.
She just immediately started screaming, "Don't let him die, don't let him die." I mean, just pleading with us to handle the problem, whatever it was.
75-year-old Stephen Beard didn't start life as a millionaire.
Steve grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and not a wealthy family, and he was trained and taught and believed in hard work. Eventually, he worked his way up into advertising, and then eventually he decided that he wanted to start a TV station.
He was a self-made man. He started a television station from scratch in Austin and built it up to be one of the major television stations in Austin, and sold it at a tremendous profit.
After Steve sold the TV station, he became a multi-millionaire. I think the TV station sold for about $54 million. He got about a third of that. But then he also had some nice real estate.
But despite his millions, by 1993, Stephen had experienced his share of hardship.
His wife, the mother of his children, died of cancer.
After her death, he was heartbroken, but his kids loved him and surrounded him. His friends loved him and surrounded him.
One of those friends was 32-year-old Celeste Martinez, who Stephen met during his wife's long illness.
He would go to the Austin Country Club, where he was a member, and have dinner, and that was his time to see people. Celeste was a waitress then at the Austin Country Club, and that's how they originally met. And they quickly went from talking to dating in a very short time.
He was, by every description of his friends, funny and fun. Celeste is a very attractive woman, blonde, bubbly, funny, and I think they just hit it off very well.
They did not date for very long before they were married at the same country club where Stephen Beard had met then Celeste Martinez.
The whirlwind romance caught friends and family by surprise, but the couple didn't care.
There was a major age difference between them, but they were in love. He loved her, she loved him.
He was about 70 years old, and she was in her early 30s. He was very drawn to this person who made him happy and made him feel good.
He was a person who had a big personality, enjoyed life, enjoyed being with his friends and family.
Stephen felt so strongly about family that he formally adopted Celeste's teenage twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer.
This was just something that Stephen wanted to do and wanted to make it clear to them that they were part of his family.
They called him Big Daddy. That was what his coworkers and friends called him, was Big Daddy.
To house his new family, Big Daddy built a magnificent new mansion in Westlake Hills.
It was opulent, and the stone walls, it just felt so safe and secure, just like a fairy book setting.
And Celeste Beard was the Cinderella at the center of it all.
Stephen doted on Celeste, and Stephen loved being able to make her happy.
But now, Celeste's happily ever after has turned into a nightmare.
Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to ambulances and police and finding that your husband, something terrible had happened to him. She was hysterical.
This man must have meant the world to her because the tone of her voice and everything was just so serious and scared, truly scared.
And the situation was about to get even more frightening.
As the medical crew were switching him from the bed to the stretchers for transport, they discovered a shotgun shell in the bedding.
At that point, things changed drastically.
180 degrees from a medical emergency to a violent crime scene.
Coming up, is there more bloodshed to come?
For all we knew, there could be bad guys in this house still.
Police responding to a 911 call from millionaire media mogul Stephen Beard have just found a spent shotgun shell in the injured man's bed.
It came out originally as a medical call. Then they realized that something else was going on, that instead he had actually been shot.
He's alert and conscious and talking to us, and so that's why I just kept going back in my head that, you know, he must have had a surgery and they had split open or something like that. I could see medical equipment beside his bed. He might have had a breathing tube providing oxygen or something. So it just reinforced to me that he was under medical duress.
It did seem so strange that he would call 911 and not have an accurate comprehension of what had occurred to him. He was probably asleep. And it was the pain that woke him up as opposed to the sound of the gun or anything.
Beard's wife Celeste and her daughter Christina appeared just as baffled as the police.
Miss Beard didn't sleep in the same bedroom as her husband.
The home had a wing with a separate bedroom for Celeste, where she slept often, because Stephen had, among other medical problems, COPD, a breathing difficulty, and he slept with a breathing machine. So the first thing that they knew was there were sirens and red lights flashing.
While EMTs rush Stephen to the hospital, police go through the mansion room by room.
For all we knew, there could be bad guys or whatever in this house still, and now we have to do a orchestrated point-by-point search of the house. And at the same time, we're checking for bad guys. We're looking for evidence.
Deputies don't find any intruders or signs of forced entry.
It appeared that the door was unlocked, which was somewhat unusual, although people leave their doors unlocked far more often than law enforcement wishes they would.
Jewelry boxes on the vanities did not appear to be pilfered. There was lots of jewelry present. There was closets full of high-end clothing. There was artwork, statues, obvious artifacts and trinkets that would be valuable left undisturbed.
Robbery's not the motive, or burglary's not the motive. They began to think that it was someone who had come there for the sole purpose of shooting Stephen Beard. So if he was the target, then why would it be that someone would target this man?
While CSI processes the house, investigators begin to question witnesses and the victim.
The detectives that respond to the scene, several, go to the hospital and interview Stephen Beard. We had probably 2 at the house interviewing people.
However, none of the witnesses, including Stephen, offer any possible leads.
He couldn't understand why he would be shot. It wasn't like he, upon realizing that it actually was a gunshot wound, that, he immediately gave us a list of people to look at.
There wasn't any talk of having enemies or anyone having idea who would do something like this or why they would do that. He was a respected man in the community, a successful guy, so everything was a mystery.
He didn't appear to be someone who would have anyone who would have some sort of vengeance against him, some reason to harm him. So then you start, looking to see what could this possibly be.
Investigators also questioned Celeste's daughter, Jennifer, who'd been staying with friends the night of the shooting.
The other daughter came in, that morning. As soon as she was notified, she returned to the house.
She was upset and, concerned about whether or not he would survive.
Jennifer's too distraught to give investigators much information. But as word of the shooting spreads and friends and family gather to support Celeste and her daughters, the shooting investigation takes a sudden turn.
One of the friends approached us and they gave us a name and suggested that it might be something that deserved to be looked into.
They thought that they had a suspect and that it was a young woman who had had contact with Celeste Beard in the past.
The woman's name is Tracy Tarleton. And when investigators follow up with Celeste's daughters, they confirm that there was no love lost between Tracy and their adopted dad.
Stephen did not approve of Tracy Tarleton, and Stephen was pretty perceptive about what he thought Tracy Tarleton was after, and that is Tracy Tarleton was after Celeste.
Coming up, did a love triangle become a ticking time bomb?
What we found was that she had, and this is her word, recruited married women who were not happy to be her lovers.
While doctors fight to save millionaire Stephen Beard, gravely injured by a shotgun blast while he slept in his mansion outside Austin, Texas, investigators have just uncovered a possible lead on the shooter's identity.
Someone at the scene that morning voiced a concern about a specific person and provided us what probably was our first lead.
Acting on the tip, detectives take a closer look at a 59-year-old Austin woman named Tracy Tarleton.
Tracy was a manager of Book People. It's a large, very popular bookstore in downtown Austin.
Tracy met Stephen Beard's wife Celeste at a local psychiatric facility several months before the shooting.
Celeste suffered from depression, and she did check into a psychiatric hospital a couple of times dealing with her problems, and she met Tracy Tarleton.
Tracy at the time had a pretty significant problem with alcohol, and it got to the point where she was feeling suicidal.
Tracy had some legitimate issues that she was trying to deal with.
Her mental health would go, and then she'd start self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. And when that would happen, her bipolar disorder would kick into gear.
During their brief time together, the two women became friends.
Celeste felt sorry for Tracy. Tracy's not very attractive physically. Celeste felt sorry for her.
Tracy is funny, and Tracy is bright. I think they had similar sense of humors, that they could get along.
After they were both out of the hospital, they did continue a friendship.
Because of the communications they were having, long phone calls, Stephen Beard realized that Celeste Beard was involved in some kind of what seemed to be a very serious friendship to him at the time with Tracy Tarleton. But he at that point had never met Tracy Tarleton.
That changed in August of 1999, a little more than a month before the shooting.
Stephen Beard decides he wants to meet this person who seems to be such an integral part of his wife's life. And then Celeste Beard invites Tracy over. Stephen Beard is friendly toward Tracy, welcomes her into his home, cooks dinner for them.
But after dinner, while Tracy and Celeste are sitting outside, things took an unexpected turn.
Tracy was drunk and trying to kiss Celeste.
Christina sees them kiss. And then she goes to tell Steve what she witnessed. Stephen Beard confronts Tracy and tells her she needs to leave. He's not violent about it. He doesn't throw her out of the house. He tells her she needs to leave, and she does leave.
She had stormed out of the house, and she was arrested that night by the Austin police. The charge was driving while intoxicated.
Now investigators wonder, had Celeste's would-be lover sought her revenge?
Tracy is having these mental issues, a very fragile person emotionally, and she meets Celeste Beard, and she falls in love with Celeste Beard.
Tracy firmly believed the thing standing between her everlasting happiness with Celeste was Stephen Beard.
When confronted by police, Tracy doesn't deny shooting Stephen.
When the investigating officers went to Tracy Tarleton's home in South Austin, she was surrounded by candles and photographs of Celeste, obsessed with Celeste. She turned over the shotgun to him. I suppose she knew that the jig was up, that she was caught.
Investigators take Tracy into custody and then inform Celeste that her friend has been arrested.
It was devastating for her. Celeste didn't want to believe that Tracy had been the one that had done this because she tried to be a friend to Tracy, and she was in denial for a long time until they tested ballistics. You can actually test ballistics of a shotgun shell. Were able to tell that the shotgun shell that was found on the floor of Stephen's bedroom was fired by the gun that Tracy Tarleton had.
While the prosecutors build their case against Tracy, Stephen struggles to overcome his devastating injuries.
He was in the hospital a couple months.
Celeste visited him as much as she could on a daily basis. She had, in anticipation of him being released from the hospital, wheelchair ramps made, looking forward to getting him home again where she could take care of him.
But Stephen never fully recovers from his wound and dies in the hospital on January 22nd, 2000.
The medical examiner said it was caused by pulmonary embolism related to him being shot. Therefore, the cause of death is the gunshot.
Before Stephen's death, she was charged with aggravated assault and injury to an elderly individual. After Stephen's death, Tracy was charged with capital murder.
Coming up, A young widow goes to any lengths to get a fresh start on love.
We found that Stephen was her fourth marriage.
Then you began to wonder if there was perhaps a more sinister connection.
At the end of February, Tracy Tarleton is in the Travis County, Texas jail, charged with murdering Austin millionaire Stephen Beard.
It wasn't a whodunit. We know who pulled the trigger. It was Tracy Tarleton.
She didn't get rid of the shotgun. I'm not sure that she actually realized that she had left evidence at the scene. So the case against her was strong.
Was Stephen Beard simply the victim of Tracy's obsession with his wife, Celeste? Or was there a piece missing?
Our minds kept coming back to this fact that it was easy for her to get in there and that none of the alarms were set in that area of the house and the door was unlocked.
I think there was suspicion from the very first night that Celeste was involved.
She may have played a role in this plan.
Although questioned repeatedly by investigators, Tracy adamantly denies that Celeste had anything to do with Stephen's death.
Even after she acknowledged that she had been in fact the one who shot Stephen Beard, she still didn't reveal any sort of encouragement that she had received, or certainly any sort of coordination with Celeste Beard.
Over the weeks that follow, friends of Stephen and Celeste started reaching out to the investigators, and their stories paint a very different picture of what investigators believed was a happy marriage.
According to the people who were hanging around with her, she was going through a lot of men, entertaining a lot of sexual partners. She was living an extremely extravagant, lavish, single lifestyle.
After Stephen died, Celeste just kind of went crazy. She went on a spree of drinking and partying and going out and making a mess of her life.
You know, going on a trip to New Orleans and other places, taking girlfriends along, hanging out at 6th Street, going to all the bars, just celebrating life.
According to friends, she's also burning through Stephen's millions at an alarming rate.
From the funeral on, Celeste Beard seems intent on squandering the rest of Stephen Beard's estate. It's just a girl gone wild is what it seemed like after Stephen Beard's death.
Based on her unusual behavior following her husband's death, investigators began digging into Celeste's past.
We found that Stephen was her fourth marriage. She had had marriages along the West Coast before she moved to Austin with her third husband.
Celeste and her third husband divorced shortly before she married Stephen, but according to friends, they continued to sleep together after the divorce.
Celeste would have affairs with her ex-husband, but she said she never thought of it as an affair because she had already been married to him, so it didn't count as an affair.
In addition to the infidelity, investigators also learned that Celeste has a criminal record.
She had been charged with a fraud crime in Arizona, for which she was on probation for, unknown to Stephen Beard at the time they had been married.
Then you began to wonder whether or not there was perhaps a more sinister connection between Tracy and Celeste Beard.
There was no way that we were going to be able to prove a case against Celeste without Tracy's testimony. So Tracy's lawyers from the beginning were hinting around to the prosecutors that Tracy had a story to tell, and they wanted immunity for her testimony. But the DA's office was not willing to give her complete immunity and no punishment.
Once again, Tracy refuses to implicate Celeste.
She was hesitant to make any sort of connection as far as motivation to Celeste.
But would Tracy change her tune after Celeste met a new man?
She met Cole Johnson at a bar where he was bartending on 6th Street. For Celeste Beard, that's kind of par for the course.
He kind of straightened her up, saw that she was being very self-destructive, and convinced her to pull back.
Then, in July of 2000, just a few months after meeting, and barely 6 months after Stephen's death, Celeste and Cole become man and wife.
There's no question, given her history, that she's going to be married again soon. But, ultimately, that was her downfall, and it was clear from that marriage to Cole Johnson. Tracy Tarleton decided that she should come forward and tell the truth.
Tracy realized that she had been used and became willing to tell the rest of the story.
Coming up, the wages of a marriage gone haywire.
Celeste despised the fact that she had to have a sexual relationship with him.
Awaiting trial for the murder of Austin media mogul Stephen Beard, 42-year-old Tracy Tarleton has refused to implicate Beard's wife Celeste in the Millionaires' murder.
She's going to take responsibility for this murder. She's not going to name Celeste Beard as being involved in it. She's just going to take the full rap, but then she's betrayed by Celeste Beard.
A few months after Stephen's death, Celeste meets a bartender named Cole Johnson, and he becomes her fifth husband.
And what Tracy Tarleton provided was the details of the planning and the actual details of Celeste Beard encouraging, aiding, and assisting her in causing the death of Stephen Beard. She gave all the details.
Tracy tells detectives that at first, money hadn't been an issue for Celeste.
In order to make sure that she had access to her own money, he set up a trust fund for her, and he put in $500,000, $500,000 in this trust fund. She just blew through it. It was 6 months that she went through that $500,000. It's not clear exactly where all the money was going. A lot of it was in high-end fashion, stuff that she never ever wore, handbags and dresses and jewelry.
Celeste bragged one day that somebody asked her, "What's the most you've ever spent in one day?" And she said $50,000.
Stephen Beard approaches her and says, "You are squandering this entire estate. You are destroying everything I've spent my life building. I can't be with you anymore." He begins divorce proceedings. Her response to that is like she's going to kill herself. And then she's taken to the psychiatric unit of a local hospital for treatment. And it meets this woman by the name of Tracy Tarleton.
I think Celeste manipulated everyone in her life, including her husband and her children, and then later Tracy Tarleton. And she was able to manipulate Tracy because Tracy was particularly vulnerable.
They right away started some kind of close friendship. I think early on they were very huggy and even kissed.
According to Tracy, Celeste also made it clear that she was unhappy with Stephen.
She despised the fact that she had to have a sexual relationship with him every once in a while.
There was evidence that Celeste had been drugging Stephen, that she would crush up sleeping pills and put them in his food, and that she would substitute Everclear for vodka in his drinks, just have him pass out so that I don't have to deal with him.
And then Celeste would go out and party all night long. And the next day she would be difficult to wake up because she'd been up all night.
Tracy tells police that once they were both out of the psychiatric hospital, Celeste continued to drug her husband and sneak out to spend time with her new friend.
Celeste Beard went out of her way to have contact with Tracy Tarleton and increase this relationship to the point that it became a sexual relationship.
From the prosecution standpoint, yes, it seemed like she was using sex and love to get what she wanted from Tracy. And to Tracy, the love was the important thing.
According to Tracy, Celeste made what she wanted abundantly clear.
It had been kind of planted in her mind that Celeste was being, treated horribly by Stephen Beard, that if he were to be gotten rid of, that she and Celeste could be together.
Tracy's motive was simply love. She loved Celeste Beard. She's never been anything other than totally honest with us.
And Celeste had everything to gain from her husband's death.
He was probably going to divorce her. They had a prenuptial agreement, and any money that she was entitled to related to those agreements, she had already spent.
But if they were still married at the time of his death, she was going to be in a position to inherit his wealth. What Celeste stood to gain was mostly the money.
Tracy says that once she agreed to kill Stephen, Celeste had promised to clear her path.
The alarm system would be off, and the door would be open. She could get in and get out undetected.
She came into the bedroom, shot him in the stomach, and then left.
But she'd failed to kill Stephen outright and left a vital piece of evidence behind.
It was a very poorly planned shooting. She used a 20-gauge shotgun with birdshot. The only shell that was fired ejected, and it was left there.
Tracy Tarleton pulled the trigger. The evidence clearly shows that. But the only reason Tracy Tarleton pulled the trigger in this case was because of Celeste Beard.
Once Tracy flipped and agreed to testify against Celeste, then the prosecution got an indictment against Celeste and had her arrested.
She was charged with capital murder. The automatic punishment if you're found guilty is life in prison.
Coming up, a dramatic trial becomes a loving parent's worst nightmare.
Just for Celeste to sit in the courtroom, it destroyed her.
When Celeste Beard goes on trial for murder in March of 2003, the salacious details have all of Austin, Texas buzzing.
You had a person who hoped to be a rich heiress with this lesbian lover who ultimately murders her rich older husband by shotgun. So all those things added up to what was basically for many people a soap opera that they couldn't stop following.
This perhaps mentally imbalanced woman killing out of lesbian love, and it sounded like some kind of made-for-TV movie.
The prosecution lays out their case first.
The evidence will show that what happened here is a simple case of a greedy, manipulative defendant who took advantage of a mentally ill woman who was in love with her.
Tracy would be showing up at the trial to say she pulled the trigger. So the question of the trial was, why would Tracy Tarleton kill Stephen Beard? Was there somebody who encouraged her, aided her, assisted her, who pushed her to pull the trigger? And so our case focused on proving the relationship between Tracy Tarleton and Celeste Beard.
Her testimony came across as very believable because she did not minimize her involvement in it. And she acknowledged right up front that she had committed this murder, that she had done this thing that was wrong, and that she deserved to be punished for it.
She also has some surprising backup.
Both daughters, Jennifer and Christina, testified against their mother.
They really corroborated some things that even Tracy had said, and so it helped to bolster Tracy's testimony.
They understood and witnessed that this was a actual romantic relationship. One of them saw them in bed together. One of them saw them kissing on at least a couple of occasions.
Her daughter's testimony is a cruel blow for Celeste.
He was our dad. We loved him. And he took him away from us.
Celeste was crushed that they turned against her. Just for Celeste to sit in the courtroom with her daughter on the witness stand talking about things that would hurt Celeste, it destroyed her.
But when it's the defense's turn, they claim that Celeste's daughters had their own motive to betray their mother.
The daughters did this thinking that they would get more of Stephen's inheritance.
I think the defense tried to also kind of paint them as, angry teenagers striking out against their mother.
Tracy knew that the defense's whole case also depended on attacking her. And so their strategy was to attack her as mentally ill and delusional and predatory.
We believe that the evidence will show you Tracy Tarleton is not worthy of belief. Tracy was delusional. The delusion was that she and Celeste were lovers. Celeste denied it. Celeste had resisted her advances.
The defense tried to kind of paint her as some mentally unbalanced person who had this affection that was not returned and that she was acting clearly on her own.
Will it be enough to convince the jury that Celeste is innocent?
The jury was out several days. I was very hopeful. The longer a jury deliberates, the more you know that there are members of the jury that have a different view from the prosecution.
Finally, after nearly 3 days of deliberation, the jury makes its decision.
The jury came back with a guilty on capital murder.
I remember her being pretty emotional. She really had thought she was going to get away with it.
Instead of enjoying Stephen's millions, Celeste will most likely spend the rest of her life in prison.
Capital murder is automatic life sentence.
So she has an eligibility for parole, but it's like another 20 plus years from now.
In exchange for her testimony, Tracy receives a 20-year sentence with the possibility of parole in 10 years.
Steve's family was involved in the decision to offer Tracy a deal. They felt like Tracy is not a person who would have done this on her own.
You have a gentle soul who's pushed to this crazy act of murder. And she causes this death that she's going to have wear on her soul for the rest of her life.
After the trial was over, the family requested to meet with Tracy and expressed their thanks to her for telling the truth and for making it possible for Celeste to be held accountable for their father's death. Celeste loved money. She loved material things. She loved status. And in the end, that was more important to her than her husband, her children, and the people in her life.
They were a big, happy family living in small-town America.
We all moved in and we were kind of like the Brady Bunch.
Until they were stricken by a mysterious and life-threatening illness.
Doctors are stumped as to what's happening. Could she be patient 0?
They done tests and everything, but for a long time, we had no idea what was wrong with us.
But what looked like a possible outbreak ended up being more sinister than anyone could have imagined.
All it said was, you and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you will die.
He thought he was smarter than everyone, including the police.
October 1988. In Winter Haven, Florida, 41-year-old Peggy Carr is rushed to the hospital by her family after she collapsed in pain.
She couldn't talk. She couldn't hardly move. She's known sign language all of her life because her parents were deaf. So she signed to me and my sister about how bad she was hurting.
She was in such excruciating pain, she had to be physically carried into the ER.
At first they thought it was a flu, and then they recognized this is more than the flu. There's something going on here.
Doctors were mystified because you don't see that typically in an ER. They ask her, what was your last meal? Did you drink some water that maybe you typically didn't drink? They have to ask her all of these questions, and they still can't find the answer. It was bizarre.
They just could not isolate it down until they brought in a neurologist who suggested that it was some kind of poisoning.
Peggy Carr was a hard-working mother of 3 from Fort Meade, Florida.
My mom always smiled. She was a people person. She was always happy, and she always took good care of us kids.
Peggy and her first husband, Larry, had been married 14 years. They had 2 sons and a daughter, but the marriage didn't last.
He got in trouble all the time, and he wasn't the best husband. He was always drinking. He was an alcoholic, and she just got tired of it.
After the divorce, Peggy got a job waitressing at the local diner and focused on raising her kids. But it wasn't easy.
We would come to her restaurant, she would serve us, and she was a super hard worker. She was always working. It seemed like she would have 12, 14-hour shifts.
A new romance was the last thing on Peggy's mind.
I remember her telling me that she met this great guy. His name was Pat. He used to frequent the restaurant because it's right there where his work was at. He would come in and flirt with her.
Most everyone called him Pat. He was a foreman at a phosphate mine, and after his shift, he would go to the diner and sit in her section. It turned out they had a lot in common. He was divorced with kids of his own, so it wasn't that surprising when they started dating.
I remember him coming to pick up my mom, and he had a Monte Carlo SS, which I fell in love with. So I just thought he was the coolest thing.
After dating for several months, the two decided to get married in 1988. Peggy and her 3 children moved in with Pi, his adult daughter, and his teenage son, Travis. The blended family of 7 made their home in the nearby town of Alturas.
It's a happy little town. We had a Circle K. There's a nice little church, dirt roads. Everybody's friendly. Everybody waves when they go by each other. Just a really good place to have a family.
People there leave their doors unlocked. Their windows are open.
Everybody knows everybody in Alturas, and they like it that way.
And I remember us referring to the Brady Bunch, We had a big table, and it was always full of food. My mom was happy, and, she had a good man, and we had more brothers and sisters, so we were all happy at the time.
The kids would often invite friends over, and it wasn't uncommon for the gatherings to spill out into their yard. But Peggy didn't mind. She enjoyed welcoming people into her home.
We were typical teenagers. We had pool parties. It was always loud over there. We were working on our trucks in the driveway. We were riding our 3-wheelers.
But the Carr family's happiness wouldn't last forever. Now, Peggy has been poisoned, and authorities need to know how it happened.
Then her 2 sons started to exhibit symptoms as well.
Me and Travis, our feet were killing us. We could just barely graze our feet, and we would just, holler.
At that point, everyone is extremely concerned. Is this the start of some sort of widespread contamination?
Coming up, detectives suspect Peggy may have been poisoned by the person she trusted most.
They suspected he was having an affair. He had the motive to do it.
"41-year-old Peggy Carr and her 2 teenage sons have been hospitalized after exhibiting symptoms of a severe poisoning, as doctors search for the source of their suffering."
For a long time, it seemed like we had no idea what was wrong with us. And we were just freaking out and, it's just really scary.
Finally, doctors receive lab results that reveal the suspected poison.
The lab results show that Peggy Carr was poisoned with thallium nitrate.
It is a toxic heavy metal. It causes your nerves and muscles to shrivel and die.
I think they run 1,000 tests on us. She had like 55 times the amount that it takes to kill one human. I had like 19 times, and Travis had like 25 times the amount. That's what they told us.
The amount of poison that she had, what it was doing to her, essentially, it was killing her on the inside. Her body was decomposing.
Thallium is most commonly used in rat poison, so the first thought was that she had been accidentally contaminated. But it's rare to have something like this happen to one person. So to have 3 from the same family, that couldn't be a coincidence. So everyone was on high alert. County officials, along with local law enforcement, were looking into what could be an enormous public health crisis.
But finding the source of the poison won't be easy.
It's very hard for anybody to detect because you can't smell it, it's odorless, and it's tasteless.
The rat poison containing thallium has been outlawed since 1972, so it's difficult to come by.
There were all sorts of theories of how this family could have come in contact with such a high concentration of a dangerous chemical, and they had to look into all of them.
Is there something toxic in the air, in the water? Or what if it was something from the mine in this community?
Authorities also had to consider the frightening possibility of widespread contamination.
This came not long after the initial poisoning of the Tylenol in Chicago using cyanide. And then there were other instances of tampering with commercial products like that. So naturally, detectives were concerned.
I can remember Mr. Mincy, Ernie Mincy, telling me, we got CSI at your house right now, and we're checking everything from mustard to mayonnaise.
More than 400 items were taken from the Carr home and sent to a state lab in Jacksonville for testing. Food from the refrigerator, ice cubes from the freezer, even scrapings from the floors and walls. But it was going to take a while for the results to come back.
In the meantime, the Polk County Sheriff's Office begins their own investigation.
They come in, ask us a ton of questions. Do we have any people that don't like us? Do we have any enemies? And of course we said no, because, we were kids.
Peggy was well liked. She lived in that community. She grew up in that community. So what possible motive would someone have?
Unfortunately, Peggy couldn't give them any answers. The poison had taken a toll on her, and she could not communicate.
But Peggy's family had plenty to say, and according to them, the Carr's marriage wasn't as perfect as it appeared to be.
They were good out of the gate. Everything seemed to be going fine. She found Prince charming. Then he started to not be around as much, not be as affectionate.
They'd only been married 6 months, and there were already rumors that her husband was having an affair. She was very troubled by it, devastated by it.
When she found out that he was cheating, I don't think she confronted either one of them. I think she was just mad and sad. They were so quick to get married, so quick to fall in love, and then so quick to forget why they fell in love in the first place.
Peggy was kind, but she wasn't weak. She refused to let Pye treat her that way, so she took her kids to go stay in a hotel.
But it wouldn't be long before Peggy had a change of heart.
He did come to the hotel crying, begging her, he'll change, just smoozing her, trying to get her to come back home.
She ultimately decided to give him a second chance and move back into their house with the kids. But things were different after that.
They weren't holding hands, and, she didn't seem like she was smitten anymore. She seemed like she was troubled about her marriage. It was very hard for me to see her like that. She was just so depressed all the time.
According to Peggy's son, Dwayne, her depression turned to fear when she discovered Pi had been keeping another secret from her.
She found out he took out a large life insurance policy on her. She talked to me a couple times about how she was scared.
You have to wonder if he could have been trying to kill his wife for the insurance money and accidentally poisoned the kids as well.
Early on in the investigation, Pi was definitely a suspect. He was considered by the sheriff's office very closely.
Before they question Pi, investigators have the rest of the family tested.
They have to make sure everyone who's been affected is receiving treatment. Depending on how many people have been poisoned, any possible charges against him could change as well.
Everybody who was living in that house pretty much was affected by it. They all had traces of thallium in their systems on several different levels.
One of the test results is especially surprising.
It turned out Pi had been poisoned as well. It's hard to know what to make of this. Does it mean he's innocent as well? Or does it show just how much planning he put into this?
People are sinister enough that, sure, why not just eat a little bit of the poison myself to throw detectives off the trail? Like, look, there's no way I would poison my wife because I suffered from it too.
Pi isn't the only one. Trace amounts of thallium were found in the entire family. But only Peggy, her son Dwayne, and Pi's son Travis were affected enough to need medical treatment.
One of the primary reasons the detectives working this case considered Pi less of a suspect is because his own son Travis had become so ill. He was probably the most affected by the thallium after Peggy. There was certainly a question of why would someone do that to his own son.
With Pi cleared as a suspect, police wonder who could have hated the Carrs enough to poison them. Coming up, a mysterious note will expose a new suspect.
You would have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you will all die. This is no joke.
It's been several days since Peggy Carr and her sons were admitted to Winter Haven Hospital with thallium poisoning, and doctors are struggling to keep them alive.
The thallium in her system, it affected her in many ways. Her hair began to fall out just in clumps. She lost a lot of weight, and it finally just took such a toll that they had to put her into a coma in order for her to even tolerate the side effects.
Travis and Dwayne had less of the poison in their systems, but they weren't doing too well either.
We started losing our hair. I couldn't walk at the time. I'm just waiting for one of us to go into a coma or get sicker.
About 5 months before Peggy got sick, the family received a letter in the mail that was just a typed note that stated, "You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you will all die."
It was a little post-it. We was at the table eating. My mom was kind of freaked out. I thought it was funny. My buddies and my brother thought it was funny.
The letter provides detectives with a clue to help find the person threatening the Carrs.
Alturas is a very small community. So all the mail that comes through Alturas has to go through another community called Bartow.
The letter was specifically addressed to Pi Carr in Bartow, which only someone familiar with the local address system would know. So they were looking for someone local.
It looked like there was somebody outside of their family who was threatening them.
Polk County doesn't really see a whole lot of crime, and as a result, the sheriff's department is pretty small. They needed more resources to help with the investigation, so they called in the FBI for assistance.
The FBI took the elements of this crime to the Behavioral Sciences Unit and asked them if they could come up with a profile.
They said that it was a white male in his 30s, very high IQ, who liked to leave a trail of threats and liked to watch from a distance and see the victims in the case suffer.
It doesn't take long for investigators to come up with another lead.
Detectives, as well as the FBI, interview people in the neighborhood to see if they can gain some information that may have been missed the first time around. And then lo and behold, a witness told them that Peggy actually had an argument with her neighbor Diana, and it was a heated one.
Diana lived next door to the Carrs with her husband, George. They apparently didn't like all the noise and commotion going on over there on a regular basis.
We were doing donuts in the driveway, me and a couple friends and my brother, Travis. And we had the music really loud, just being teenagers. And I remember she walked over and she said, oh my God, y'all need to turn that down.
Diana was rather insistent that Peggy needed to rein in her kids. And they had a shouting match.
My mom tried to keep her cool, because you don't want to make your next door neighbor mad. But she was really defensive at her because she was trying to protect her children, basically.
At the time, it appeared to be a simple neighborhood argument. But in light of recent events, detectives are interested in hearing what George and Diana Trepal have to say.
When police went over there, George answered the door. He was a short, middle-aged white man with thick glasses and a gray beard. He sort of looked like an aging hippie.
He and Diana had been married for about 8 years. They liked their solitude. They liked living out in the country, kind of on their own. They were very active in the Mensa group, and that was kind of their social outlet.
He is a computer programmer and a technical writer. He works from 7 a.m. until at night. His life is his job.
He told detectives that his office was right next to his wife's orthopedic surgery practice in Bartow, which is about 7 or 8 miles away from Alturas.
During the interview, the detectives and the FBI discovered that George Trepal had lived next door to the Carrs for several years. They also discovered during that time that he didn't like them very much. He actually didn't like them at all.
George's answers immediately raised investigators' suspicions.
He would shake. He made some unusual noises with his mouth, almost like a clucking noise, as if he had dry mouth.
He appeared to be very nervous, and innocent people are nervous.
He said a lot of things during the interview that could have been taken as a motive, but one thing in particular stood out.
When he was asked why somebody would want to hurt the Carr family, he told detectives that he thought somebody probably just wanted them to move away.
Any average person would probably say, oh my gosh, I have no idea why anybody would want to poison her. Instead, George Trepal came back and gave them a reason.
A reason known only to police and the person who wrote the death threat.
George Trepal looked like a bookworm, not someone who would poison his next-door neighbors. But looks can be deceiving.
Coming up, detectives identify the source of the poison.
The entire family drank out of those bottles.
It's a chilling thought. Someone had snuck into the house and left these bottles full of poison.
The FBI and Polk County Sheriff's Department are considering George Trepal and his wife as suspects in the poisoning of Peggy Carr and her children.
At the hospital, doctors were still treating Peggy Carr and her 2 sons. She'd been put in a medically induced coma to help combat the effects of the poison.
Dwayne and Travis were slowly improving, but Peggy just continued to get worse. The thallium was just too deeply embedded in her system that she just couldn't overcome it.
She was on a ventilator and they were keeping her alive. No brain activity. It just wasn't Mom there anymore.
On March 3rd, 1989, almost 5 months after falling ill, Peggy Carr was disconnected from life support. She died shortly thereafter.
Not only is it a heavy blow for the family to take, but it also means the FBI and Florida police are officially investigating a homicide now. George and Diana Trappell seem to have motive, but they still have no idea how the cars were poisoned.
But that would change when the test results came back on the hundreds of items police had taken from the Carr home.
The lab techs were able to isolate the source of the poison. It turned out to be some Coke bottles that were left in the kitchen. And they all contained thallium nitrate.
We used to have this little cubby hole where, we put extra cases of water, whatever, and that's where it was.
The next question was, how did the poison get into those bottles? It definitely wasn't something that happened at the bottling plant, so they're looking for signs of tampering.
We are talking about Coke bottles where you've got to pop it open. So the person who did this actually had to find a way to pop open the Coke bottle, pour in the poison, and then get the cap back on. Forensics was able to determine that a small screwdriver blade was used to open up those Coke bottles.
It had been done so skillfully that Peggy and her family never realized the danger they were in.
In October of 1988, Peggy thought she had the flu, and her family was trying to take care of her to make her feel better. Part of that was by bringing her Coca-Cola pretty frequently, thinking that would settle her system. And the worse she felt, the more Coke they gave her, thinking that would make her feel better.
Of course, the irony is they were poisoning her to death while poisoning themselves, too.
But Peggy's sons tell police they should have been more suspicious.
My mother loved Pepsi, not Coke. She always had to have her Pepsi. She was a caffeine addict, So there was never Coke in the house.
With so many kids coming in and out of the house, nobody thought twice about it at the time. Any one of their friends could have brought those drinks over. But in hindsight, it's a chilling thought. Someone had snuck into the house and left these bottles full of poison.
Could that someone be the Carr's seemingly harmless neighbor, George Trappell?
He certainly struck them as suspicious when they spoke to him the first time. But the police know very little about him at that point, so they put a surveillance team on him.
George Trappell is a very intelligent man. They were very active in the Mensa group, and that was kind of their social outlet.
Mensa is comprised of a group of individuals that rank in the top 2% of intelligence levels in the country.
One of the first things detectives realize is that George has been keeping secrets from them.
Initially, he told detectives that his office was right next to his wife's orthopedic surgery practice in Bartow.
The fact is, he worked from home. There was no office in Bartow. It's a strange thing to lie about for no apparent reason. But if he's lying about that, what else is he hiding?
Detectives also start looking into his background. They learned in 1975, he actually served time in prison for dealing amphetamine. The DEA agent suspected that Trappell was the mastermind behind the amphetamine production.
That's significant because thallium sulfate is sometimes used by chemists who are illegally making amphetamines.
With all this information coming in, detectives have to be thinking, this guy matches the FBI profile, 41 years old, highly intelligent, he is well-versed on poisons.
But it isn't enough to get a search warrant or make an arrest. Detectives need to find hard evidence linking Trappell to the crime.
The Polk County Sheriff decided to send someone undercover to get closer to George. Officer Susan Gorek was chosen for the job.
She had been with the Sheriff's Department for several years at that point. She's very intelligent. She's very astute. She's very quick. And they felt like she would be able to fit into a Mensa group.
From their surveillance, they knew that he and his wife were planning a murder mystery weekend for their local Mensa chapter. It was the perfect opportunity for Susan to introduce herself.
She became Sherry Gwynn. a very lonely woman going through a horrible, messy divorce in Texas. She wanted to get away from all of that, so she moved to the small community in Florida. It could not have gone better. It was like the gods were on her side. She walks into the location of this murder mystery weekend, and lo and behold, you know who hands her the pamphlet? George Trappell.
When Susan reads the details of George's voodoo-themed murder mystery, she can hardly believe her eyes.
A passage in the document read, "Few voodooists believe they can be killed by psychic means, but no one doubts that he can be poisoned. When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic."
She went there hoping to gain George's trust and to start gathering information. She didn't expect him to give her a full confession.
It's right there in black and white. It is like George Trappell is actually bragging about the murder of Peggy Carr.
Coming up, an undercover agent tries to avoid becoming her target's next victim.
She was with a cold-blooded killer, and she knew she had to keep her guard up.
Investigators believe 40-year-old computer programmer George Trappell is actually the mastermind of a deadly plot to murder his noisy neighbors. To prove it, they've sent undercover officer Susan Gorick to befriend him.
She basically strokes George Trappell's ego. It was a way to get close to him. She appeared needy. She needed a friend. She needed someone that could guide her. I think he embraced that role.
The murder mystery weekend went as well as anyone could have hoped. Susan did manage to get close to Trappell, but aside from the pamphlet, she wasn't able to come up with any incriminating evidence. He didn't confide in her or let anything slip.
To catch Peggy's killer, it seems Susan will have to keep up the charade a little longer.
George Trappell's wife is a doctor. She's not home a lot. He has all the time in the world. So all of a sudden, these two start doing things together. They start cementing their friendship. They do things like go to the Salvador Dali Museum in St. Petersburg. They go out to dinner in restaurants in Ybor City. They even have picnics at a lake nearby.
She understood the things that George was interested in so that she could bring him up. Things like photography and science fiction and plants and botany and things like that.
Every single day, she's getting closer and closer to George Trappell. And every single day, he's getting closer and closer to her.
But Susan knows that even the slightest mistake could cost her everything.
Susan never let her guard down. She always knew she was with a cold-blooded killer.
When they would go out to dinner or they would go out to lunch, if she had to use the ladies' room and she came back, she never touched her water, her coffee, any food she left on her plate.
This goes on for quite a while, and George still hasn't told her anything they can use. It's looking like he's either innocent or he's on to her and even smarter than they thought.
This was supposed to be an 8-week undercover assignment. It's turning into 8 months.
Investigators are determined to bring Peggy's killer to justice, but their undercover operation seems to have hit a standstill.
Susan spent countless hours with him, and they just poured a lot of effort into this. They hoped they would come away with a confession, but unfortunately that never came.
Something had to give. They didn't want to let him get away with murder, but they were running out of ideas and resources.
Until suddenly, after 9 months of being undercover, Susan's hard work seems to finally pay off.
Out of the blue one day, George tells Susan that his wife moved her practice from Bartow to the neighboring town of Sebring. They're planning to move to a new house so she can be closer to work.
Susan saw an opportunity. She brought in her abusive marriage and the need for a place to live. And that prompted Trapal to suggest that she rent his house in Alturas. And that's exactly what happened.
Access to Trapal's home gives detectives the break they've been waiting for.
They search every room of that house looking for evidence to link him to the poisoned Coke bottles. And they find a workbench. Inside is a small brown vial containing a white crystal substance.
They test it immediately, and it ends up being thallium. Now they have strong, concrete evidence to issue an arrest warrant.
On April 5th, 1990, over a year after Peggy Carr's death, George Trapal is arrested for murder.
It was early in the morning when FBI agent Brad Brecky and Sheriff's Office Detective Ernie Mincy went down to Sebring to take George into custody. When they got there, Diana would not let them in the house. She virtually used her own body to barricade the front door.
They had to restrain her. They go into the house. They see George Trapal standing at the foot of the stairs in bikini briefs. They ask him to put on some clothes, and finally, they arrest him.
Among the books they found when they were searching through George's house down in Sebring was a book entitled Poison Detection in Human Organs. And there was a chapter on thallium, and there was indication that he had been interested in that particular chapter.
It wasn't quite a smoking gun, but as far as circumstantial evidence goes, it was pretty strong. This guy had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. And he had an ego big enough to make him think he could get away with it.
Coming up, the case against George Trapal takes an unexpected turn.
Pieces of his past were not allowed to be presented at his trial.
After a year-long investigation, the FBI and Florida police have charged George Trapal with the murder of his next-door neighbor, Peggy Carr.
The indictments included 1 count of first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, in addition to multiple counts of tampering with a consumer product.
On January 7th, 1991, over 2 years after Peggy Carr first fell ill, George Trapal's murder trial begins.
State Attorney John Aguero called a total of 49 witnesses to testify, including experts from Coca-Cola, doctors who treated Peggy Carr, family members, and the DEA agent who arrested Trapal on the amphetamine charges back in 1975.
The prosecution presented a very methodical case to the jury. They presented it in such a way that each element built on the previous element.
The evidence they found on its own, it may mean nothing, but you have to take a look at the totality. And there are just too many coincidences.
In order to believe that George Trapal was innocent, you had to believe that it was just a coincidence that there's a bottle of thallium in his shed. That it's just a coincidence that he's got a book that has a chapter on death by poisoning. That it's purely coincidence that this letter shows up at the Carr household, and 5 months later, Trapal mentions something about, well, somebody was just trying to get them to move out of the neighborhood.
The state's attorney posits that when the Carr family ignored his warnings, George decided to take matters into his own hands.
He conjured an image of Trapal at the workbench in his garage, carefully cooking the thallium, adding it to the soda bottles, and then crimping the caps back on. He theorized that Trapal left the tainted beverages in the Carr home, knowing that eventually they would drink it.
But the defense argues that prosecutors have no physical evidence proving George had anything to do with the poisoning.
They suggested that the police, who had invested enormous manpower into the case, singled out George because he was different, and then twisted the facts and coached witnesses to suit their theory.
George Trappell's defense attorneys were able to bring in some inconsistencies in this case, including statements made by Travis Carr. He said when he was in the hospital that he was the one that brought the Coke bottles home.
George's lawyers even suggest there was a much more likely suspect, one investigators conveniently overlooked.
Eventually, they brought in Diana, George's wife, and painted her as a possible scapegoat for George, that she was behind it and not him. And he was obviously upset about that he did not want her to be brought into the trial. But the lawyers felt like that was necessary.
This could give him an avenue out. I mean, she blocked the door and did not want detectives entering their home. She also yelled and screamed at Peggy Carr. She is also extremely intelligent. She's part of this Mensa Society, and she's a surgeon.
She had just as much reason to want to get rid of the Carrs and had more skill and knowledge than her husband. They argued that the thallium found in the home could just as easily have belonged to her.
On February 6th, 1991, the jury comes back with a verdict.
I remember standing next to Susan Gorick when the jury came back in. And I remember looking at her at one point and saying, "Susan, breathe." She was just holding her breath. And I think all of us were kind of collectively holding our breath because there was a lot riding on this verdict. And the jury wasn't out real long for as complicated as this trial was.
It turned out they didn't have anything to worry about. The jury found him guilty on each and every count.
The jury convicted Trappell of the first-degree murder of Peggy Carr, and they also found him guilty of attempted murder on each of the others in the family.
1 month later, George Trappell receives his sentence.
The jury recommended by a vote of 9-3 that George should die for the death of Peggy Carr.
Florida is one of the few states in the country that did not have to have a unanimous verdict for death. Now we do. So now all 12 of the jurors have to agree to death, and then the judge signs off on it. At the time that George Trappell was going to trial, it was not the case.
One man's sinister plot for revenge had torn a family apart and left their Florida community forever changed.
I was young. You shouldn't have to put up with garbage like that when you're 15 years old. You should worry about dances and proms or whatever, you know. Me and my brother and my sister were alone most of our life because our dad was never around. So she was the only thing that we had, you know, that was stable in our lives.
I don't think a community ever recovers from a crime like this. You're always going to be talking about it. It changes your view on safety. If it could happen to Peggy Carr, a 41-year-old waitress just trying to put food on the family table and take care of the family, something like this could happen to anybody.